Does anyone remember these commercials? I sure as hell don't. I wasn't even born yet, but I'm sure a lot of you older gamers remember those glory days when Nintendo and Sega were competing with one another. Just by watching that commercial, you just see how much has changed since then. Sega and Nintendo today have devolved into a joke. Sega is nearly going bankrupt, and Nintendo is losing its place in the console market. Speaking of Nintendo and Sega, back in those days, Sega and Nintendo fanboys were at each other's throats. Sega fanboys would say the Genesis is 16-bit and also has blast processing.
The Sega Genesis has blast processing. Super Nintendo doesn't. So what's blast processing do?
Then Nintendo fanboys would come up with a rebuttal and say, oh yeah? Well, we have an awesome sound card that gives the SNES superior sound. Then eventually it would all devolve into a pissing match over who had the better toy. If there's one thing that kept perpetuating the idea that video games are nothing but toys, it was because of fanboyism. To me, fanboys just depress me. They lack any capability of using constructive criticism and can't be critical towards anything they like. Fanboyism doesn't just apply to consoles either. It can even be an undying loyalty to a developer, and no matter how much their beloved developer fucks up, they ignore it and continue to love it while in blissful ignorance. Does anyone remember how much Kojima dick riders were defending MGS5 The Phantom Pain when it was first released? They were defending a game that was supposedly unfinished. Well, at least in terms of story. Don't get me wrong, MGS5 is a well-made game. It's been in development for years, and sadly, the story was unfinished. While the gameplay was top-notch, the story was literally unfinished. It just abruptly ends, and that's what we got for the conclusion of the MGS franchise. But when brought up to Kojima fanboys, they would respond with, Kojima intentionally left the game unfinished, just to leave you with the feeling of a phantom pain. Was it intentional, or is that just a very convenient excuse? Now, enough of me getting off topic, let's get back to Nintendo and Sega. While I see fanboyism to be childish, ironically though, fanboyism back then seemed a lot more legitimate. Hear me out here. When comparing Microsoft and Sony fanboys to Sega and Nintendo fanboys back in the day, you'll probably be thinking to yourself, what are console fanboys fighting over again? When looking at both Xbox and PS4 individually, they're both very similar to one another, unlike their two older brothers. Most differences between both consoles are very subtle and barely noticeable. Sure, hardware-wise there is some differences. When you look at both consoles objectively, PS4 is the more powerful console. It can handle most games at 1080p, the Xbox cannot. If you, for example, bought both the Xbox and PS4 versions of Fallout 4 and compared the two, would you really notice much difference? Sony fanboys bragging how the PS4 can handle 1080p isn't really something to write home about because 1080p has been a thing for quite a while now, and it was something that was promised with the last generation of consoles, but we didn't get that. Well, to be more accurate, it was Sony who was promising 1080p with the PS3 and talking about how their console is hot shit. But all we got was 720p, but did it really matter we didn't get 1080p? No, because switching from 480 to 720 was a huge difference either way, and if you compared 720 to 1080p, I really doubt you would notice much of a difference unless you had a magnifying glass. Both the Xbox 360 and PS3 were similar in most areas, sure, but both are more different to one another than the Xbox and PS4. Try looking at both the 360 and PS3 from an online standpoint. I can easily sum up both online services like this: Xbox Live wins and PSN loses. It's as simple as that. Xbox Live was a superior online service and PSN at the time was very lacking. Not only that, they were very different hardware-wise. The 360 wasn't as powerful as the PS3, but it was more friendly to game devs. The PS3, on the other hand, was a spiffy piece of tech, but it had a bit of a learning curve for game devs. Most developers didn't get it, which is why many PS3 multiplats were very buggy, which made the 360 the dominant platform for multiplats. Developers that did get it, though, took advantage of the PS3's full hardware, and many of its exclusives look stunning compared to anything on the 360. Also, the DualShock and 360 controllers was very different to one another, until Sony decided to make their controller a little more similar to an Xbox controller. So overall, whether you're playing on PS4 or Xbone, it just feels all the same. Compare that to the Genesis and Super Nintendo. Both consoles were drastically different, and depending on what your tastes and preferences were, determined which console you preferred over the other. If you preferred a cool and heavy metal feel, you would pick the Genesis. If you preferred a more family-friendly kiddie console, you would pick the Super Nintendo. Not only did each console have their own exclusive titles and mascots, multiplats were very different to one another, and depending on which platform you preferred, you would have a completely different game compared to the other port. Also, there were the little things too. Games on Nintendo tend to come in boxes, but Sega would always have game cases, which is a big plus for game collectors and is now the staple thing games always use. Now, let's look at the Xbone and PS4. We have two systems that not only feel the same, play the same, and look the same, both systems overall are very underwhelming. Not only are they underpowered right out of the gate and suffering limitations already, they are both almost the same in every way. You even see it in the console exclusives, and the many AAA releases we've been getting this gen. Sunset Overdrive and Infamous Second Son were both kind of underwhelming. Sunset Overdrive for me in particular was a disappointment. It looked like a fun game. I guess looks deceived because the game got boring and repetitive 3 to 4 hours in. And then we got the Order 1886, and dear God, is this an example for next-gen gaming? Pretty visuals that are only going to look dated years later? How about some experimental titles with unique game mechanics? Not just bullshit tech demos. It's because of this it makes me wonder what are console fanboys even fighting for. They take their hunks of plastic so seriously they will lash out at you like you just insulted their mother. Why are they showing loyalty to a multi-million-dollar corporation that couldn't give two fucks about them, even while those same companies aren't offering shit? After getting both consoles at launch and a year later building a gaming PC, I've realized how redundant these two consoles are. Seems to me that fanboyism has boiled down to fighting over who has the least mediocre console, and the fact that fanboys still exist just depressed me. To all you fanboys out there, here's a word of advice. Grow the fuck up!